Talks on climate change take center stage as China's President Xi Jinping pledges greater cooperation with France and Germany to tackle the effects of global warming. Hello, I'm Mike Walter filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The leaders of China, Germany, and France held a virtual meeting on Friday with a commitment to work together on combating climate change. China is also talking global warming with the United States. The country's climate envoy is in Shanghai for a meeting with its Chinese counterpart, Xie Zhenhua. John Kerry's visit is seen as an effort to rally support for President Joe Biden's virtual Earth Day summit, which will happen next week. Joining us now, much to discuss about all of this. Straight ahead, our panel. Joining us from Beijing, Victor Gao. He's a current affairs commentator and chair professor at Soochow University. Here in Washington, Shihoko Goto is deputy director for Geo-economics with the Asia program at the Wilson Center. Sourabh Gupta joining us from Maryland. He's the resident senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. And also with us from Washington, CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. And I want to welcome all of you to the broadcast. Victor, let's start with you. Give me your take on this meeting. You've got these three major players, France, Germany, China, all talking about climate change today. What does this tell us about China trying to take the lead on this important issue?
Thank you very much for having me. I think climate change is the most important issue facing mankind as a whole, and all countries, big or small, need to join in this global effort to deal with the climate change effect. Now, for China, Germany, and France to join hands in looking at this issue and coordinating their action, especially within the climate change accord execution process, this is absolutely important. And this also sets a good example, sets a good precedent for other major countries to not only doing the right thing respectively in their own capacity, but also cooperating, coordinating with other major stakeholders. And in this context, I think this summit dialogue between China and Germany and France on the one hand, and between China and the United States right now going on, is actually very important. This also paves the way for the very good, highly expected global climate change virtual summit very soon to be held.
Sourabh, Victor makes a good point. Global warming, of course, an existential threat. You've got a lot of countries post-pandemic starting to focus on this. The United States, one of those countries. And Chinese news agency Xinhua quoted President Xi as saying this: responding to climate change is a common cause of all mankind. It should not become a geopolitical bargaining chip, a target for attacks on other countries, or an excuse for trade barriers. Give me your thoughts on his comments. What is he trying to say there?
What he was trying to say is that this is a common threat to all, and what is a common threat to all is something which should unify everybody in terms of trying to address that threat. This threat comes in context of U.S. statements, written statements, suggesting that it may perhaps try to maneuver with some of its allies and partners in terms of putting up a front with regard to cooperating within a smaller circle of friends and partners, while also demanding a lot from others. But I don't think one should read too deeply into this, because in the interim strategic guidance that the U.S. administration put out, guidelines, it's kind of its interim national security strategy. It elevated common threats that no one country can face, as the #1 threat, even before any particular country was named as a geopolitical threat. So I think the U.S. administration is moving and operating on that basis, so one shouldn't read too much into that. What I would say, though, is that trade policy has really come to the forefront here, because there is a clash between trade policy interests and trade policy rules, and how do you mainstream climate change. And those rules cannot be in opposition to each other. And so I think one needs to have a conversation of how do we mainstream climate rules also within trade policy rules. And one should not look at this as that they are necessarily in conflict with each other.
Of course, all of these countries have set goals, and of course, China, the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases last year, President Xi saying that they would achieve a peak in carbon dioxide emissions before 2030, carbon neutrality. They're looking for 2060 to be that magic year. China's also going to be hosting this UN Summit on Biodiversity in October. Again, Victor, this kind of sends a signal, doesn't it? China is one of the big powerhouse countries out there, really trying to make climate change elevated as an issue.
Well, indeed, I think the government announced a goal for China to achieve these goals by 2030 on the one hand and 2060 on the other hand are very arduous goals, very challenging goals for China as a nation. However, I think the whole Chinese nation, people everywhere in China, are fully united behind this commitment of the nation. And I hope we can not only achieve this goal by 2030 and 2060 respectively, but through our joint efforts, through our great sacrifices and commitment, we can even achieve the goal ahead of time. This is why I think the whole country of China is being fully mobilized. Governments, entities, corporates, individuals, families, etc. We are all pitching in, trying to figure out what's the better way to do this, how to achieve them, not only on time, but hopefully ahead of time. So this is the mega trend in China. All of us need to do the right thing, and China should not only do the right thing by itself, but also join the international community, all the other stakeholders, to collectively doing the right thing, because only in this way can we really make a meaningful change to the negative impact created by the climate change.
Nathan, you know, we're talking about climate change this last year with the pandemic. I can remember driving into work, hardly any traffic, which, as you know, in Washington, D.C., that's pretty amazing. And we still have this issue. I mean, it's still out there. It's pressing. John Kerry in Shanghai today to talk about it. What can you tell us about this meeting? What was he hoping to achieve?
Well, I mean, if you look at the Biden administration, their whole election campaign was called Build Back Better. And as you know, there was this Green New Deal plan, which was floated during the election campaign, which the Republicans kind of really freaked out about, and the progressives really liked. Now, what he's done sneakily, although not that sneakily, is introduce hundreds of billions of dollars into his infrastructure plan for green initiatives. We're talking about lithium batteries. We're talking about electrification of vehicles. We're talking about railways. In fact, essentially, it looks like a 5-year plan 10 years ago from China, which is quite incredible. And essentially what they're saying is we need to compete with China as well as cooperate when it comes to the industries of tomorrow, because Beijing and Washington both know this one fact, that rebuilding an economy for the 21st century on efficient fuels is actually going to make a lot of money. It's going to be efficient. It's going to be being able to deliver public goods to a lot more people much more efficiently. The trouble is you need investment. So John Kerry's in Shanghai, which, by the way, won't exist if countries don't get their act together and sea levels rise, nor will New York. And essentially, they can cooperate like we saw at the beginning with in 2015 with Xi Jinping and then Barack Obama in September of 2015 before the Paris Accord in December. They can cooperate on the rules of the road, and that's very important as we go to sort of implementation phase of Paris. But the one thing I want to say, and you saw this in the Beijing, Berlin, Paris meeting, is that the U.S. has been absent for the last 4 years when it comes to climate change. They pulled out on the Trump administration from the Paris Climate Accord. There was no negotiations essentially on climate. And the world is kind of saying, look, welcome back, but you don't just get to claim that leadership back for free. As other countries have moved on, Europe's far ahead when it comes to cutting emissions. China is rolling out more electrification program, cutting down on coal power plants. So I think this is a bit of a test for the Biden administration as they head into this summit next week for Global Earth Day with about 40 world leaders. Let's see, but that's kind of where it is.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Victor, let's talk about this meeting in Shanghai, because it comes amid increased tensions between China and the United States. They're sparring over a number of issues. But this is, as Nathan pointed out, this is an issue where the U.S. and China have come together. Of course, it was President Xi and President Obama who really pushed it over the finish line with the Paris Climate Accords. Is this an area where we can see a reset, a rebuilding of relations? I mean, where are we there?
Well, first of all, Mr. John Kerry is highly regarded. He contributed a great deal to the conclusion of the Paris Climate Accord last time. And it was really a very big occasion when President Obama and President Xi Jinping of China signed the accord together in front of the United Nations General Secretary. That gave hope to mankind as a whole. It was very, very troubling and very, very unfortunate that the United States under Trump withdrew from the climate change accord. And I hope the big lesson the Americans should learn is that you should not behave like a spoiled child, join an agreement internationally one day, withdraw the other day, and try to re-engage the third day. This is not the statesmanship or leadership role that the United States should play. So this time, I hope the United States under President Biden should do the right thing, because to work together with other major countries, including China, in dealing with climate change impact is the only right thing for the United States, for China, for all the other major countries, big or small, as well as for mankind as a whole. And while the United States, including Mr. John Kerry, have been emphasizing that they want to compartmentalize climate change negotiations and keep putting pressure on China on the other fronts, I hope China-U.S. cooperation for climate change negotiations will set a precedent and demonstrate to everyone in the world that China and the United States can talk earnestly, look into each other's eye, and cooperate on major issues like climate change. So this should give us confidence that China and the United States eventually will be able to use their wisdom and courage and vision to deal with whatever problems there are in their bilateral relations. China and the United States need to get along with each other, need to live and let live between these two great nations. They do not need to get onto each other's jugular, for example, and the rest of the world should give a sigh of relief, because the future for China-U.S. relations should be more promising than some of the pessimists try to paint the negative megatrend for China-U.S. relations.
Well, Sourabh, let's talk a little bit about what Victor's talked about and Nathan. You know, this stepping away from the table and then trying to re-engage. Obviously, the U.S. facing a lot of blowback from walking away from the Paris Climate Accords. Now, of course, the Biden administration trying to make climate change a priority. But this is from a piece in the Global Times. Quote, the U.S. has neither the moral standing nor the real power to issue orders to China over climate issues. How much has the U.S. lost in terms of standing on this issue, and how much ground does the Biden administration have to make up after 4 years of the Trump administration?
I wouldn't say it has lost too much ground or too much standing, because the U.S. has been, and particularly the Democrats have been, leaders in the climate change arena. U.S. cities and states have also been very active, even as the Trump administration moved away from climate change. But you do touch on an important issue. I mean, what if Mr. Biden is voted out in 2024?
Good point.
These are supposed to be enforceable pledges. Will the next Republican president be willing to hold those pledges? Now, you know, in the climate change arena, we are asking a lot of developing countries. For developed countries, they're postmodern, and their energy intensity use, they don't use as much energy. While for developing countries, they still need their clean coal power plants, et cetera, et cetera. And now we are asking a lot of developing countries to really put forward very aggressive targets. So, I mean, it causes pain out there. And therefore, we cannot have someone like the United States stepping in, stepping out, and not being bound by those targets. And therefore, the question of enforceability will come in. And I think the U.S. will need to address this. And I think part of the reason the Chinese have been a little upset because of late is because rhetorically, the U.S.-China relationship is not on a good plane as yet. And remember, in the Phase 1 agreement, trade agreement, the United States was asking China to have these in national legislation, these commitments memorialized in national legislation. What if China turned around and told the U.S., you know what, it's fine, Mr. Biden saying all these things and signing all these documents, but can you also memorialize it in something which passes in Congress? And that can raise real questions out here. But I think at the end of the day, we must find our commonalities. All the parties wish to succeed on this front. And I think on that basis, they should be able to find flexible targets which work, but also all driving towards a common purpose.
Shihoko, let's talk about targets set by Japan. They're rather ambitious. It's the world's third largest economy. They promised under the Paris Accord to reduce emissions by 26% by 2030. Some, though, say that's not going far enough in terms of meeting a carbon neutral goal, which the country set for 2050. Give us a sense of where Japan is on this issue.
Well, Japan has made a commitment to meet those goals. One, because the climate change challenge is a very real one. Remember, the Indo-Pacific is made up of countries large and small, and a lot of them are Pacific Island countries that are vital partners for Japan. And if things continue the way they are, they will actually cease to exist. So there's an urgency on the part of Japan to do the right thing. But as you said, it is easy to set those targets, and it's much more difficult to actually meet those targets. And I think that is a challenge that all countries are going to be facing, not just Japan. What makes Japan more interesting, though, is that because it is so resource poor, as a lot of Northeast Asian countries are, they are incentivized to be much more creative about turning to alternative energy sources and also becoming more energy efficient. And combine that with the fact that Japan has this very systemic risk to its economic trajectory. That is to say, the demographic challenge as well as a vulnerability to natural disasters. It does need to shift a lot of those economic resources into something that it could actually provide as a solution. So if Japan does this well, it can actually be at the forefront of being more energy efficient, being more carbon neutral, and be able to export those technologies and at the forefront yet again, just as it had been in the technology sector in the 20th century. This is a way forward for Japan to promote itself in the new economy.
Nathan, another big story here in Washington on this Friday. President Biden playing host to his first foreign visitor, which just happens to be the Japanese Prime Minister. Talk to us about the significance of that and what they discussed.
Yeah, I think it's hugely significant that you have your closest Asian ally as the first visit by a Prime Minister here of the Biden administration. I mean, it's not from Europe, not from the Middle East, and it's Prime Minister Suga. And it's obviously following on the back of the Antony Blinken Secretary of State tour to Tokyo and Seoul and the talks in Alaska with China, very much suggesting that the focus of this administration, as well as the pullout from Afghanistan, is not going to be on South Asia, it's going to be on the Pacific and Asia, and obviously China. Now, I think if you watch the press conference, and also Prime Minister Suga just gave a briefing to one of the think tanks here, there's quite a bit of distance between the two, especially when it comes to sort of finger pointing at Beijing. While Japan has criticized, along with the Biden administration, China's human rights situation, there is a lot more respect for Chinese sovereignty in terms of Xinjiang and elsewhere in the rhetoric than there is in the Biden administration. Also, one of the things that Suga didn't bring up directly in front of Biden, I don't remember, but did at the think tank was, look, we want this comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership free trade deal to expand and deepen. Remember, the Trump administration pulled out of that. The Biden administration won't rejoin it because it's unpopular with the Democratic base. So that's one key ask that Japan won't get. And they really stuck their neck out for the Americans during the negotiations. So it's going to be very interesting. And of course, remember, a lot of the tensions between Tokyo and Seoul were sort of papered over by the rhetoric we saw in Alaska between the U.S. and China. But that is very real at the moment, and it's frustrating policy coordination when it comes to DPRK, Pyongyang's missile and nuclear deterrence. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this alliance goes forward, especially as the Biden administration, while drawing down troops in, say, Afghanistan, want more power sharing and commitment from allies in Asia, hence the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S., but isn't necessarily ready to live up to their end of the bargain, whether it be on trade or signing the law of the sea, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot going on.
Victor, let's listen to a little bit of what the U.S. president had to say after this meeting. I want to get your reaction after on the other side. Let's listen right now.
We committed to working together to take on the challenges from China and on issues like the East China Sea, the South China Sea, as well as North Korea, to ensure a future of a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Kind of drumming away at the challenges of China again. This is the kind of rhetoric we've been hearing from this new administration. What's going to be the take in Beijing from this?
Well, first of all, I think if the United States is up to containing China, it will fail. If it acts by itself, it will fail if it attempts to join with several other countries. Mainly because the megatrend that we all need to realize is the peaceful rise of China. And no one can realistically expect that they can contain the rise of China or the continued development of China. And as a result of this pandemic, the people throughout China are becoming more and more united under the leadership of the Chinese government and the Chinese ruling party. And they realize that the only right thing for them to do is to keep peaceful development, maintaining domestic stability, contributing to world peace. And this is the megatrend of the 21st century. So I'm afraid Mr. Biden or his team will fail miserably if its ultimate goal is to contain China. On the other hand, when President Biden met with the Prime Minister of Japan, I hope they will talk about the proposed dumping of the nuclear waste water into the Pacific Ocean. That's a human disaster. That's what the United States and the whole international community need to convince the Japanese government not to do. And half of the population of Japan is opposed to that. So this is as equally important as our discussions about the climate change impact. And let's hope the United States and Japan do the right thing and avoid a human disaster from happening by contaminating the water of the Pacific Ocean and, in its turn, probably the water in the Atlantic Ocean and in the Indian Ocean. This is the most top priority that President Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister Shihoko should talk about, rather than containing China. Contain the disposal of wastewater into the Pacific.
Shihoko, I went back and watched an interview I did with you in November of 2016, because at that time it was the first visit again. Trump was not even president. He was president-elect, and he hosted Shinzo Abe, then the prime minister, in the Trump Towers. And the reason for that meeting, it was very important for Abe, because Trump had said all these inflammatory things on the campaign trail, wanted to make sure the relationship was still in good stead. It seemed, though, this time around, Biden needed this meeting more than Suga, in the sense that he wants to show this unified front. So talk to us about this relationship between the United States and Japan after 4 years of Trump.
Well, they both need each other. And there's greater recognition now by the United States that Japan is a very important partner for U.S. policies in the Indo-Pacific. What is interesting about this particular meeting is that, again, the first foreign leader that Biden actually chooses to meet at the White House was the Prime Minister of Japan. Why is that? It is because the United States is much more focused on what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, and it is concerned about relations with China. And the Biden administration has talked consistently about working with allies and partners. And in the region, Japan is America's biggest and most dependable ally. And that has not wavered under the Trump administration, and it continues under the Biden administration as well. And during these talks today, there were really two major issues that were raised. One is about meeting the China challenge, as the security implications, as the changes and challenges in the regional order and the stability in the regional order. The word status quo was used a number of times by both Biden and Suga. The other issue is to talk about competitiveness, that there is concern about the playing field in the economic arena not being fair, but at the same time there is a need for both Japan and the United States to be able to rise to the challenges of the industrial bases of the 21st century, that is to say in the digital arena, in AI, in the computing sector, all of these issues that really require not just the best brains of one country or another, but cooperation amongst countries. And Japan and the United States today really reaffirmed that very publicly to say that they share values, they are both committed to transparency and the rule of law, and these are important areas that require cooperation to move forward.
Nathan, let's listen to a little bit of what the Prime Minister had to say, and then I want to talk to you about his comments on the other side. Let's listen.
Sure.
On North Korea, we confirmed our commitment to the CVID of all weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles of all ranges, and agreed to demand North Korea to fulfill its obligations under Security Council resolutions.
Nathan, it seemed like pretty much boilerplate stuff.
Yeah.
Not really breaking any new ground. And again, one of the issues I think Victor brought up is, you know, this they call it treated water. Of course, in the region, they're calling it radioactive, contaminated water. He's got issues with his neighbors, both South Korea and China, with regards to the water that's going into the Pacific. So he kind of has to thread the needle, doesn't he?
Yeah, and look, with all respect to Victor, and I do understand Beijing's concerns about this, and you're right, that Tokyo has been asked by the IAEA to consult neighbors like Beijing and Seoul. But the science behind this, even though it sounds spooky, is not as frightening as he did make out. But I get why people are pushing this, because it is scary on the face of it. But this has been done before, and the Fukushima disaster was awful, and the whole area helped, and that was great. But it is a warning also about, as you look for greener energy, and let's face it, France has done extremely well because it's dominant in nuclear energy. That is going to be part of the mix. So the idea of, if there are accidents, how we dispose of this is definitely a regional discussion to have to go for. But you're absolutely right also, in terms of the region. You know, Japan, obviously a key security ally of the US, and also a key economic player, but also a key diplomatic player. And they do not see eye to eye with Washington on a lot of things, especially when it comes to, for example, differences between the Republic of Korea, and also differences when it comes to the DPRK. I mean, you know, where do the missiles land? Generally in, you know, the East China Sea or the Sea of Japan, depending on where you sit. They do not like the sunshine policy of Seoul, but they don't also have any new ideas, and were very reticent about the sort of 1 minute fire and fury and the next minute love fest that we saw with the Trump administration. And I think that essentially, because the Biden administration hasn't fully detailed what the DPRK policy is, because let's face it, it's an impossible task, and every administration fails. You know, they're looking for new ideas, but there doesn't seem to be any. So that's going to be different. And they're also, you know, let's face it, Japan's been very involved in Myanmar, for example. There was no real mention of that. Yeah. And there are other concerns that essentially Japan doesn't see addressed by the US at all.
Nathan, thanks so much. I want to thank all of our participants. It was a great conversation. Appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.